I can still remember the perfume that clung to my husband's shirt that night, heavy and floral. Nothing like the crisp cologne he usually wore. The scent hit me before I saw the faint smudge on his collar, a mark the color of wine. For a moment, I stood frozen in the doorway of our bedroom, my mind spinning, my heart thudding so hard I thought I might collapse. Mark was humming softly in the bathroom, casual and unbothered, while I stared at the proof that something in our marriage had shifted. It was such a small detail, barely noticeable, but it was enough to fracture the quiet certainty I had clung to for more than 2 decades. Before I go on, let me pause for a moment. If you've ever been blindsided by the people you trusted most, you'll understand the storm of emotions I felt. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear more stories of family secrets and the quiet revenge that follows. My name is Elena Brooks. I am 46 years old, and for most of my adult life, I thought I had built a stable, respectable existence. I grew up in a working-class family in Indiana, the oldest of 3 girls, the one who always played peacemaker when tempers flared. Counseling came naturally to me, and when I eventually became a high school counselor, it felt like I had found my calling. I spent my days guiding teenagers through struggles with grades, friends, and self-worth, and then came home to a husband and daughter I believed were my safe place. Mark and I met in college, him with his ambitious smile and business degree plans, me with my quiet determination to build something lasting. We married in our 20s, bought a modest house in the suburbs, and raised our daughter Lily in what looked like a picture-perfect home. Mark rose quickly in regional sales, his charm opening doors that discipline alone might not have. I prided myself on being the grounding force, steady paychecks, a warm home dinners around the table. To friends and neighbors, we were the kind of family that proved effort and commitment could still build a good life. For years, that surface harmony was enough. We had Sunday lunches with his father, Walter, who never missed an opportunity to remind us of the importance of loyalty. Lily flourished at school, bright and determined with a stubborn streak that reminded me of myself at her age. And Mark, well, he seemed content, or at least he played the role convincingly. He traveled often for work, came home with stories of clients and quotas, and though I sometimes wished for more tenderness, I believed we were solid. Looking back, I can see that there were cracks I ignored. The late nights explained away by networking the text messages answered in another room, the subtle shift in his attentiveness when we attended events with friends. Tessa, my longtime friend turned social butterfly of the neighborhood, was always nearby, laughing at Mark's jokes, brushing his arm a little too casually. I told myself it was harmless that I was being paranoid, but deep down, something had started to feel wrong. That night with the perfume and the stain, I didn't confront him. I folded the thought neatly and tucked it away the way women often do when they aren't ready to shatter their own world. But I couldn't ignore the unease that lingered, a whisper in my chest, reminding me that safety and certainty are more fragile than we like to believe. And as I lay awake beside him, listening to his even breathing, I understood with chilling clarity that my life was about to change, though I didn't yet know how deeply the betrayal would cut. It was the following Saturday when the first undeniable crack in my marriage made itself clear. Mark and I had been invited to a neighborhood dinner at Joanne Miller's house, something of a tradition on our street. Joanne loved to gather people together, filling her dining room with laughter wine glasses and the smell of roast chicken that seemed to cling to her drapes for days afterward. I had baked a pie earlier that afternoon, and I remember carrying it in with a smile, determined to shake off the unease that had been following me all week. The living room was already crowded when we arrived. Mark went straight to the men gathered near the fireplace, but my eyes caught on Tessa almost immediately. She was standing by the kitchen island, radiant as always, her dark hair pinned back with a jeweled clip and a glass of wine in her hand. She laughed at something one of the men said, tilting her head back, and when her gaze shifted, it landed on Mark as though she had been waiting for him all evening. I tried to settle into conversation with Joanne and a few others, but my attention kept straying. Across the room, Mark had joined Tessa. She touched his arm lightly as she spoke, leaning in close enough that their heads nearly brushed together. To anyone else, it might have looked harmless, but I had known Tessa for nearly 20 years, and I recognized the way she reserved that soft, attentive smile for men she wanted to impress. My stomach tightened as I pretended to listen to Joanne describe her new garden project. At dinner, the seating seemed almost orchestrated. Tessa slid into the chair beside Mark before I could move her hand grazing the back of his shoulder, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I sat opposite them listening as she asked about his work trip to Chicago, the details of which he had shared with me only in fragments. He answered her with an ease I hadn't heard in months, describing meetings and clients exaggerating his successes, while she laughed softly at every anecdote. My fork felt heavy in my hand, and I realized I had hardly touched my food. Halfway through the meal, Joanne leaned toward me and whispered, "They've gotten close, haven't they?" Her tone was light, but it cut through me like ice. I forced a smile and said something about them working together on the Chamber of Commerce gala last year, but the seed had been planted. Others were noticing too. The small touches, the shared glances, the way his attention tilted toward her, even when the rest of the table erupted in conversation. After dinner, when people began drifting toward the living room again, I excused myself and stepped outside into the cool night air. My heart was pounding, though nothing overt had been said or done. Still, the shift was undeniable. The perfume on his shirt, the stain I had seen, now joined by a public display of something I could no longer pretend was coincidence. Mark found me a few minutes later, his jacket draped loosely over his arm. "There you are," he said, his voice casual. "You okay?" "I'm fine," I answered, though my voice betrayed me with a slight tremor. He studied me for a moment, then smiled that same smile that had once made me believe every word he said. "You're quiet tonight," he remarked, brushing a stray hair from my shoulder. "Don't worry so much." I wanted to believe him, to let his reassurance carry me back to the safety I had always clung to. But as we walked back inside, I saw Tessa glance at him again, and the look they shared told me everything words could not. The days that followed seemed to magnify the distance between us. Mark's phone buzzed more often, his explanations vague, his laughter softer when he thought I wasn't listening. Lily noticed too, though she didn't say much. One evening, as I tucked her books into her backpack for the next day, she asked casually, "Is Dad going to be home for dinner tomorrow?" When I said yes, her relief was quiet but telling. Even she felt the growing absence. The following week, another small betrayal arrived, like a stone dropped into still water. I had gone to the grocery store late in the afternoon, and as I pulled into our driveway, I noticed Tessa's car parked 2 houses down. She was standing on the sidewalk, her phone to her ear, but when she saw me, she offered a wave that felt both forced and knowing. My arms tightened around the grocery bags, and by the time I reached the front door, Mark was already inside, claiming he had just returned from the office. I didn't confront him, not yet. Instead, I moved through the evening with quiet efficiency, cooking dinner, clearing the table, folding laundry, each task a shield against the storm gathering inside me. But when I lay down that night, the distance between us felt like a canyon. His body was close, but his attention, his warmth, his loyalty, those had shifted elsewhere. It was in those quiet hours, staring at the ceiling in the dark, that I began to accept what I had been avoiding. The signs weren't vague anymore. They were clear enough to bruise. And though I hadn't yet decided what to do, I knew with certainty that this was only the beginning, and that the real test of my strength was still to come. The days after Joanne's dinner passed like moving through fog. I went about my routine counseling students, cooking meals, folding laundry, yet each task felt heavier than before. My mind played back every glance between Mark and Tessa, every moment of laughter that seemed to exclude me. I wanted to tell myself I was imagining things, but even Lily's quiet questions about her father's absences told me the truth was visible beyond my own eyes. Silence became my armor. At school, I found myself lingering in the empty hallways after the last bell, listening to the echo of lockers closing. It was easier than going home to the strained quiet of our house. Mark's schedule had grown unpredictable, filled with late meetings and last-minute trips. When he was home, his attention seemed elsewhere, his phone always in hand, his smile a mask I could no longer trust. I tried to hold conversations, but most ended with him distracted, nodding at messages instead of my words. One night, I decided to make his favorite dinner, roast chicken, with rosemary potatoes in an effort to bridge the widening gap. Lily helped me set the table, her expression hopeful as the kitchen filled with the familiar scent. Mark arrived an hour late, carrying a half-hearted excuse about a client call. He sat down, scrolled through his phone between bites, and barely looked up when Lily shared her excitement about her upcoming choir concert. My chest ached as I watched her face fall, her voice fading as she realized he wasn't listening. Later that evening, as I loaded the dishwasher, Lily leaned against the counter. "Mom," she whispered, "do you think Dad likes spending time with us anymore?" Her eyes, wide and uncertain, pierced me deeper than anything Mark had said. I forced a steady tone, assuring her that he loved her, but inside, I felt something crumble. It wasn't just me carrying the weight of his neglect. Our daughter was bearing it too. The following weekend brought another reminder. We attended a community fundraiser, one of those small-town events where everyone knows everyone else's business. Tessa was there, of course, organizing the raffle with her usual charm. Mark gravitated toward her almost immediately, offering to help carry boxes, his hand lingering too long when she passed him a clipboard. I stood near the refreshment table holding a paper cup of lemonade that had lost its chill, while whispers buzzed faintly behind me. Two women, both neighbors I had known for years, lowered their voices as they glanced in Mark's direction. My cheeks burned not from what they said, but from knowing I had become the subject of their pity. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling while Mark snored softly beside me. The house was still, yet my thoughts refused to quiet. I felt invisible, a shadow in my own home. I remembered the years I had spent building this life, the sacrifices, the quiet dedication, the endless small acts that kept our family steady. And now each effort felt erased, replaced by the growing bond he flaunted with someone I once trusted as a friend. I began to avoid confrontation not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. Arguing with him seemed pointless when his mind was already elsewhere. Instead, I poured my energy into Lily, helping her prepare for her concert, reminding her that at least one parent was present. I attended every rehearsal I could, clapping the loudest when her voice carried above the rest. Those evenings gave me solace, though even then, a part of me longed for Mark to notice what he was missing. The pressure grew in small, cutting ways. One afternoon, while sorting laundry, I found a receipt tucked into Mark's pocket from a restaurant across town, the kind of place we used to visit for anniversaries. The date printed at the top matched the night he had claimed to be working late. My hands trembled as I stared at it, the ink smudging slightly under my thumb. I folded it quietly and slipped it into my dresser drawer, unwilling yet to confront, but unable to throw it away. Even Walter, my father-in-law, began to sense the tension. He visited one Sunday afternoon, sitting with Lily in the living room while I made tea. When Mark came home later than expected, Walter's eyes followed him carefully, his jaw tightening at the casual excuse about traffic. Though he didn't say anything directly, I caught the weight in his gaze. It was a look that said he recognized more than he would voice aloud. As the weeks stretched on, my heart felt heavier each day. I woke early to prepare Lily's breakfast, stayed late at school to avoid the silence of home, and filled my journal with thoughts I couldn't speak. My handwriting grew shaky, the pages filled with words like invisible and unworthy. I had never considered myself fragile, but the quiet erosion of trust left me questioning everything: my marriage, my friendships, even my own sense of worth. Still, I didn't break. Not yet. I smiled when neighbors waved, listened patiently to students, and carried on with the duties of wife and mother. But inside, a hollow space was growing, one that could no longer be ignored. I had spent months swallowing doubts, burying pain beneath routine, convincing myself that things might improve. Yet deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't a rough season. It was the beginning of an unraveling, and while I hadn't yet decided how to face it, I could feel the moment approaching when silence would no longer be enough. The turning point came on a Thursday evening, one of those spring nights when the air was soft and the neighborhood smelled faintly of lilacs. I had just returned from Lily's choir rehearsal, still humming the melody of their final song, when I saw Mark's car parked 2 streets over instead of in our driveway. I slowed my walk, my eyes following the line of trees until I caught sight of him. He was standing outside Tessa's house, leaning against his car with his head bent close to hers, their silhouettes outlined by the porch light. She laughed quietly, brushing a hand over his sleeve, and he didn't move away. I froze in place, the sound of Lily's laughter echoing faintly from the passenger seat as she scrolled on her phone, unaware of what I was seeing. My hands gripped the steering wheel, every nerve in my body telling me to drive on and pretend I hadn't witnessed it. But the truth pressed so hard against my chest that I could barely breathe. When Mark finally stepped back, Tessa touched his arm one last time, and they disappeared inside together, leaving me staring at the empty porch. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake beside him, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, while my own pulse hammered in my ears. I thought of every excuse he had given me every late night, every vague explanation, and realized that I had been piecing together a puzzle whose image was now clear. I was no longer clinging to suspicion. I was holding undeniable truth. The following day, my clarity deepened. At school, Harold Kim stopped by my office to deliver documents for the Foundation's scholarship program. As he placed the folder on my desk, he hesitated. "I saw Mark at the chamber dinner last week," he said, carefully. He seemed very comfortable with Tessa. He didn't add more, but his expression carried a weight of pity I couldn't ignore. After he left, I closed my office door and allowed myself to cry for the first time in weeks. The tears came not from shock anymore, but from the realization that others could see the unraveling I had tried so hard to hide. At home that evening, Lily sat at the kitchen counter, tapping her pencil against her notebook. "Dad's working late again?" she asked without looking up. My throat tightened as I nodded. "He's been working late a lot," she murmured. Her voice was quiet, but the heaviness behind it broke me. I realized then that my silence was not protecting her. It was only teaching her how to accept neglect. I began to watch Mark differently. When he walked through the door with a smile, I noticed how it never reached his eyes. When he kissed my cheek out of habit, I felt how little warmth lingered. He carried his phone everywhere, turning it face down when it buzzed on the counter. I no longer asked questions because the answers were already written in the way he avoided my gaze. One evening, as I folded laundry, I found another slip of evidence. A theater ticket stub tucked into his jacket pocket, dated the same night he had told me he was in a meeting downtown. My hands trembled as I held it, the fabric soft and warm from the dryer, the stub cold and damning in my palm. I placed it in the same drawer as the restaurant receipt, a quiet archive of the lies I had endured. The silence between us grew so wide that even the smallest words fell into it and disappeared. At dinner, Lily would try to fill the space with stories from school, but Mark's distracted nods and my forced smiles only deepened the hollowness. Some nights, he didn't come home at all, claiming an overnight trip for work. I stopped waiting up for him. I would tuck Lily into bed, sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and let the minutes stretch into hours, the house dark and still except for the sound of the clock on the wall. The breaking of denial came in the simplest moment. One Saturday morning, I stood at the window with a cup of coffee, watching the neighborhood come alive with joggers and children on bicycles. Across the street, Tessa stepped out of her house in running clothes, her hair pulled back in a loose braid. A moment later, Mark's car pulled up. He got out grinning in a way I hadn't seen in years, and together they jogged down the street, their pace and rhythm, their laughter carried back on the breeze. My hands shook so badly that I set the cup down before I dropped it. That image stayed with me sharper than any words or receipts. It was the moment I knew I couldn't keep pretending. That afternoon, I took Lily to Walter's house for a visit. As she sat with him in the living room, chattering about her choir performance, Walter studied me across the rim of his coffee cup. "You've lost weight," he said finally, "and your eyes look tired." His voice was gentle, but his gaze steady. For a moment, I considered brushing it off, but the words caught in my throat. "Things aren't what they used to be," I whispered, my voice trembling. He nodded slowly as though he had already known. When we returned home, the house was quiet. Mark was out again, claiming a client dinner. I stood in our bedroom looking at the neatly made bed, the photographs on the dresser, the life we had built over 20 years. For the first time, I didn't feel fear or confusion. I felt clarity. The marriage I had fought to protect was already gone, replaced by a hollow performance that no longer fooled anyone, least of all, me. As I sat on the edge of the bed, the silence pressed in around me. But instead of breaking me, it steadied me. I understood now that I could no longer live as a shadow in my own home. Something inside me shifted, not with rage, but with resolve. I didn't know yet what form it would take, but I knew this much: I would no longer ignore the truth. The morning after watching Mark jog away with Tessa, I sat at the kitchen table with a pad of paper and a pen. The house was quiet sunlight spilling through the blinds, yet my mind churned with restless clarity. I no longer felt like a woman guessing at shadows. I was standing in the light of truth. For years, I had been the one to manage Bill's schedules, birthdays, and holidays, while Mark moved through the world with easy charm. If he wanted to build a new life on secrets, then I would not make it easy for him. My first steps were small, almost invisible. I called our bank and arranged to separate my checking account from the joint one we had opened years ago. The clerk's polite tone steadied me as I shifted my salary into my own name. Later that day, I updated the login to our utility accounts, leaving his email on file but removing my own. If he was too distracted to notice, he would soon learn what it felt like to carry responsibility without a safety net. At school, I threw myself into work, staying late with students who needed guidance on college applications. My outward life looked unchanged, yet inside, I felt different. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that for the first time in years, I wasn't propping up his world. When Lily asked for money for a field trip, I handed her a crisp envelope from my separate account, her smile lighting the kitchen. That moment reminded me that my energy belonged to her future, not to salvaging a man who had already chosen someone else. The next test came at dinner later that week. Mark slid into his chair, his phone buzzing with messages he didn't bother to hide. He asked if I had paid the credit card bill, his tone casual. I took a slow sip of water before answering. I took care of my part. The rest is yours now. His head snapped up, confusion flickering in his eyes. What does that mean? He demanded, but I only smiled faintly and passed the bowl of salad to Lily. It was the first time in years I had handed him the weight he so easily left to me. The tension deepened when Walter visited that weekend. We sat on the porch while Lily played piano inside, her music drifting through the open windows. Walter leaned back in his chair, his weathered hands folded. I don't know what's happening between you two, he said quietly, but I can tell you've stopped carrying him. His gaze was steady, not unkind. Don't lose yourself in his mistakes, Elena. His words lingered with me long after he left, affirming that my quiet defiance was not just survival. It was a reclaiming. I began documenting things carefully. Every receipt I found in his pockets, every late night explained away by work, every careless remark that left Lily's eyes downcast. I wrote them down. I wasn't sure yet what I would do with it all, but I knew the day would come when I would need proof. In the stillness of my bedroom, I folded ticket stubs and receipts into an envelope, each piece of paper a quiet witness to his choices. One evening, as Mark prepared to leave for yet another meeting, Lily asked if he would be at her concert the following week. His pause was too long before he said yes, and I watched the hope flicker in her expression. When he left, I knelt beside her on the couch. No matter what, I'll be there in the front row, I promised. She nodded, leaning against me, her voice barely above a whisper. I know, Mom. Her certainty both warmed and broke me. The cracks between us widened in public, too. At a Chamber of Commerce event, I caught sight of him laughing with Tessa near the buffet, their bodies angled close, their hands brushing too easily. Joanne approached me with a strained smile, pressing a glass of wine into my hand. You're stronger than you look, she murmured, her eyes darting toward them. The pity in her voice stung, but it also fueled my resolve. If the world was already whispering, then I would not stand quietly by when the truth demanded to be seen. At home that night, I opened my laptop and began discreetly reviewing our accounts, taking note of balances, credit lines, and household documents. Years of managing his carelessness had given me a map of every detail he ignored. If he believed I would stay silent, he underestimated the woman who had kept his life stitched together. My hands shook as I saved files to a private folder, but my heart felt steady. I wasn't tearing our life apart. I was preparing for the storm he had invited in. Mark grew suspicious of my calmness. You've been quiet lately, he remarked one night, his eyes narrowing across the dinner table. Is something wrong? I met his gaze evenly, the silence stretching until he shifted uncomfortably. No, I said simply, my voice firm but even. Nothing is wrong. He seemed unsettled, as though my composure unnerved him more than anger ever could. For the first time, I realized the power of stillness. Lily's concert arrived, and as promised, I sat in the front row clapping until my hands ached when her choir finished. Mark arrived halfway through, sliding into the seat beside me with a hurried excuse about traffic. I didn't respond. When Lily looked out into the audience, her eyes found mine, and that was enough. On the ride home, Mark tried to start a conversation, but I kept my attention on our daughter, asking her about each song, each rehearsal, each moment of pride. He sat in silence, excluded from the world we shared without him. That night, I placed the growing envelope of evidence back into my drawer, pressing it flat beneath a stack of sweaters. I knew the time would come when those papers, those quiet steps, would give me the strength to expose him. For now, my revenge was not in confrontation, but in preparation. I had shifted the balance, pulling back the threads he had relied on one by one. As I turned off the light, I lay in bed with a strange calmness. I didn't yet know how everything would unfold, but I knew I was no longer waiting to be broken. My silence was no longer weakness, it was strategy. And with every small step, I was moving closer to the moment when he would finally face the truth he had tried so hard to bury. The breaking point arrived on a night I hadn't planned for. Mark came home later than usual. His tie loosened the faint scent of perfume clinging to his jacket. I was sitting at the dining table with my laptop open, the envelope of evidence hidden beside me under a stack of bills. Lily had already gone to bed, and the house was hushed, leaving only the ticking of the kitchen clock. He dropped his keys on the counter and looked at me with a practiced smile. "Long day," he said, shrugging off his coat. His tone was light, but I caught the flicker of unease in his eyes when he noticed the papers spread across the table. I closed the laptop gently and met his gaze. "We need to talk," I said evenly. He hesitated, then sat down across from me, his hands restless against the wood. For months I had swallowed my questions, but that night the words came steady and unshaken. I laid the receipt from the restaurant, the ticket stub from the theater, and the notes I had written about his late nights on the table, one by one. His face drained of color. "Elena," he started, his voice faltering. "This isn't what it looks like." I leaned forward, my hands folded, my voice calm. "Then tell me what it looks like. Tell me why your life has been built with her instead of with us." His jaw tightened, his usual charm failing him. He muttered excuses about networking, about friendships, about misinterpretations, but each explanation collapsed under the weight of the evidence between us. When his tone shifted to anger, I didn't flinch. "You've been spying on me," he snapped, "twisting things to make me look guilty." I shook my head slowly. "You made yourself guilty, Mark. I just stopped pretending not to see it." The silence stretched sharp and cutting. For the first time, I saw not the man I had married, but the man he had chosen to become. The confrontation didn't end there. 2 nights later, we attended a fundraiser at the Whitmore Grand Gala that had become a tradition in our community. Mark insisted we attend together, his attempt to project unity, but I knew the cracks would not hold. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, the air filled with music and laughter. I wore a navy dress, simple and steady, while he moved through the crowd with forced ease. It was there, in front of donors and colleagues, that the final mask slipped. Tessa approached us radiant in emerald silk, her smile directed only at him. She greeted me politely, but the warmth in her eyes was reserved for Mark. When she placed her hand lightly on his arm, something in me refused to remain silent any longer. I spoke clearly, my voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "You should be careful, Tessa. People are starting to wonder why my husband spends more nights with you than with his family." The conversation around us faltered, the air shifting as faces turned. Mark stiffened, his eyes flashing, while Tessa's smile faltered into shock. Harold Kim, standing only a few steps away, cleared his throat and excused himself from the cluster of guests, his expression unreadable. Joanne, ever observant, gave me a subtle nod across the room, her lips pressed in a thin line. The whispers began almost instantly, weaving through the crowd like smoke. Mark pulled me aside, his grip firm on my arm. "What are you trying to do?" he hissed, his voice low but sharp. I looked up at him calmly. "I'm done covering for you," I said. "If you want to build your life with lies, you'll do it without me standing silent." His face hardened, the practiced charm gone, replaced by a coldness that no longer shook me. We left the gala in strained silence, the night air heavy, as we walked to the car. On the drive home, he launched into accusations, calling me bitter, ungrateful, vindictive. I let him speak until his words tangled into anger and exhaustion. Then quietly, I said, "You've mistaken my silence for weakness. That mistake ends tonight." At home, he stormed into the bedroom, slamming the door. I sat at the kitchen table once more, the evidence beside me, the sound of his anger muffled behind walls. The storm I had feared for months had arrived, but instead of breaking me, it steadied me. For the first time, I felt the full weight of control shift. Upstairs, Lily stirred, her footsteps light on the stairs. She peeked into the kitchen, her eyes wide. "Is everything okay?" she asked softly. I pulled her close, brushing her hair back. "Things are changing," I said gently, "but we'll be all right." She nodded against my shoulder, trusting me with a certainty that gave me strength. That night, as I lay awake, I knew there would be consequences. Mark would fight, deny, twist, and grasp to protect the image he had built. But I was no longer afraid of his performance. The confrontation had shifted everything. The silence that once suffocated me had become my weapon, and now his secrets no longer belonged only to me. They were seeping into the world he had tried so hard to control. The fallout from the gala spread faster than I expected. Within days, whispers reached me through colleagues and neighbors. Joanne stopped by one afternoon with a basket of muffins, her face set in sympathy. She didn't repeat what people were saying, but I could hear it in the weight of her voice. Mark's reputation was unraveling, and mine was standing intact. Mark came home angrier each night, slamming drawers and muttering under his breath. He accused me of humiliating him, of making him look like a fool, but his rage rang hollow. He had built this house of lies, and now the walls were collapsing. I stayed calm, moving through the routines of the home, my silence stronger than any defense. The more he shouted, the smaller he seemed. The first true consequence came at work. I heard about it not from him, but from Harold Kim, who stopped me after a school board meeting. He told me that word had reached the foundation about Mark's relationship with Tessa, and questions were being raised about his professionalism. "It's not just gossip anymore," Harold said gently. "He's losing the trust of people who once relied on him." I nodded, thanking him, the ache in my chest giving way to a steady calm. By the end of that week, I found a letter on the counter, his company's letterhead glaring at me. It wasn't a termination, but it was a demotion couched in language about restructuring and shifting responsibilities. His travel budget was cut, his accounts reassigned, and the title he had boasted about for years was gone. When he stormed in that night, red-faced and bitter, I stayed quiet, my hands folded around a cup of tea. He threw the letter down on the table. "Are you happy now?" he spat. I lifted my eyes slowly and said, "You did this to yourself." The unraveling continued. Tessa, once so bold in her presence, began to distance herself. I saw it in the way she crossed the street quickly one morning, rather than meet my eyes, her head bent low. Joanne later told me that Tessa had been asked to step back from planning the next chamber event because of perceptions. Whatever flame had drawn her and Mark together was now burning them both. Walter visited again, his steps heavy as he climbed the porch. He sat with me in the living room, the late afternoon sun slanting across his weathered face. "I raised him better than this," he said quietly, shaking his head. "But I can't fix what he's broken." His voice carried sorrow, but also a strange relief, as though the truth had finally stripped away years of denial. When he left, he clasped my hand and said, "Stand tall, Elena. You've done right by Lily. For Lily's sake, I kept our home steady. I cooked meals, helped with her college applications, and filled the house with enough warmth to soften the tension." But even she noticed the shift. One evening, as we washed dishes together, She asked softly, "Mom, is Dad moving out?" I paused, the warm water running over my hands before answering. "He might, sweetheart, but whatever happens will be okay." She nodded, her eyes steady with a maturity beyond her years. The breaking point for Mark came in public again. He tried to attend a chamber breakfast, walking in with his usual air of confidence, but the conversations around him fell quiet. People looked away rather than meet his eyes. Later, Joanne told me he had left early, his face tight with humiliation. For a man who thrived on charm and admiration, the silence of others was the cruelest punishment. At home, his anger dulled into something heavier. He spent hours in front of the television, his phone buzzing less often, his voice quieter. He still tried to bait me with accusations, but my calm silence left him floundering. One night, he muttered, "You've turned everyone against me." I looked at him evenly and said, "No, Mark, you did that yourself." His shoulders slumped, and for the first time, I saw not arrogance, but defeat. The final unraveling came when he received a notice from the bank. He had missed payments on a loan I hadn't even known he took out, one he had hidden under the guise of business expenses. The letter threatened collection if he didn't resolve it. I watched him crumble as he read it, his hands shaking, his face pale. In that moment, I felt no pity, only the weight of justice settling quietly in our home. As I folded the envelope of evidence back into my drawer that night, I realized I might not even need it. The truth had exposed him without my help, and the world around us had already drawn its conclusions. His downfall wasn't loud or explosive. It was a slow collapse, brick by brick, lie by lie, until nothing remained of the man he had pretended to be. When I closed my eyes that evening, I felt lighter. Justice had come not through shouting or vengeance, but through patience and truth. The storm had passed its peak, and the silence left behind carried a strange peace. Still, I knew one chapter remained, the moment when I would reclaim my own dignity, fully standing not as the woman betrayed, but as the woman who endured and emerged unbroken. The weeks after Mark's collapse unfolded with a quiet finality. The calls that once came at all hours grew fewer, then stopped altogether. His presence in the house felt less like a storm waiting to break, and more like a shadow fading from the walls. He spent more time at Walter's nursing pride that could not be rebuilt, while I carried on with Lily in a rhythm that felt steady again. I did not gloat in his losses, though justice had landed where it was due. His career was stripped of its shine, his reputation in town damaged by his own actions, and the friendship with Tessa had dissolved into silence. Even Joanne, who had been careful in her words, admitted one afternoon that people no longer looked at me with pity. Instead, they saw a woman who had endured with grace while truth revealed itself. Walter remained a steady figure, never excusing his son, but offering quiet support to Lily and me. He came to her final choir performance that spring, sitting proudly in the front row. As her voice rose with the rest of the choir, I felt a swell of something more lasting than revenge. It was dignity, hard-earned, and fully my own. At home, I began making small changes. The furniture was rearranged, the photographs taken down, the kitchen painted a soft sage Lily chose herself. Each change was a quiet declaration that this house was ours to reclaim. Evenings no longer ended in strained silence, but with laughter over Lily's college plans or shared meals at the table where every voice was heard. Mark never offered an apology, at least not in the way I once imagined. But by then, I no longer needed his words to heal. The apology had been carved into every empty chair at a community event, every client who looked elsewhere, every silence that greeted him in places where he once held sway. His world had shrunk, and mine had expanded, filled with clarity and peace. Looking back, I realize revenge was never in the shouting or the spectacle. It was in the quiet steps I took to protect myself, the patience to let truth stand on its own, and the decision to no longer carry what wasn't mine. I had thought dignity might come only after he was ruined, but instead, it arrived the moment I chose to live free of his shadow. To those listening, know this betrayal may cut deeply, but it cannot define you unless you let it. The real justice comes not only in watching falsehoods collapse, but in reclaiming your worth, your steadiness, and your peace. That is a victory no one can take away. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey spoke to you most. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.